Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Ed Moydell. I'm the president and CEO of Holden Forests and Gardens. And I want to thank all of you so much for joining us today for our very first program on our new Our Nature virtual series. We're really grateful to have you here and to share this time with our community of supporters, members, and friends at Holden Forests and Gardens. The intention behind this series is to offer you an exclusive behind the scenes look at the important and the impactful work that's being done by experts across our organization. And that includes the science and conservation work that takes place in our labs and our forests, as well as the classrooms inspiring the next generation of green stewards, as well as the people and ideas that are shaping our mission every day. This series is designed especially for you to deepen your connection to our work, to the people that do it, and to the landscapes and the research that you all help make possible. Before we wanted to get started, I just want to acknowledge and thank all of you in the audience. I reviewed the list of attendees today and saw lots of familiar faces, old friends and new ones. We have board members, we have volunteers, we have enthusiastic members and donors, members of different committees. And I especially want to thank our friend Elliot Payne for joining us today. Elliot is an emeritus director of our board, and he was also executive director of both the Cleveland Botanical Garden and the Holden Arboretum before we merged together as a single institution. And he was the staff leader when we constructed the Long Center for Plant Environmental Science, where we conduct a lot of the magic that you're going to hear about today and in the field. So we'll now transition over to the program, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Kylie Kaspick, who will get us started and introduce us to our speaker. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Hello, everyone, and I just want to echo what Ed said. Thank you so much for joining us. We're excited to kick off the series here with an outstanding speaker of our own. Joining us today is Dr. Katie Stubel, Director of Research at the Center for Plant and Environmental Science on the Holden Arboretum campus. Dr. Stubel is a restoration ecologist whose work focuses on understanding the challenges facing today's forests, identifying practical science-based solutions to help them thrive. Drawing on Holden's natural areas as living laboratories, she leads a team of researchers dedicated to fostering healthy and resilient forests, work that is increasingly vital in our changing world. We're thrilled to have Dr. Stubel with us today to learn from her expertise and leadership. And just before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping notes for you. Our presentation today is scheduled to be about 45 minutes long, and we have left time at the end here for Q&A. If you have any questions or comments throughout the whole presentation, please enter them into the Q&A on our Zoom console, and we will get to as many as we can at the end. Now that we also know that we are recording this session, and we will make it available to you in the following days after this webinar. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Katie Stubel. Katie, thank you for being here and joining us, and we're excited to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kylie. Thanks, Ed. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully. All right. You guys can see a PowerPoint now, I presume, yes? I can see no one, nor can I hear you. So if it is not going well, somebody, SOS, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to go. I am the director of research here, and I also oversee the community forestry group. So as we go through this, we're going to have a heavy emphasis on how we use our natural areas, some of the ecology research we're doing, but also a little bit of the work that we're doing increasingly in the community forestry space. And you guys, I also saw the list, are some of our biggest fans, so no surprise to you. We are at the Holden Arboretum campus today. This is what it looks like in the spring. We are ostensibly a museum, and we have collections of stuff, and our collections of stuff happens to be collections of living plants, which you know and love. Days like today, it looks more like this on campus. Still worth a visit. I'm sitting right now in the Long Science Center. So some of you guys have been here, some of you guys haven't been. I don't know if I do my cursor, if you can see it, but if we're looking at overflow parking over here in the visitor center, sort of around the corner, we have the Long Science Center, the Center for Environmental Science. And And we can see that we have our labs here as well as the growth spaces. Those are spaces shared by our conservation group, our research group, and the collections group. And when I think about the Arboretum and the Botanical Garden, I think of two really big assets. And that is we have these living collections of plants from around the world, around the state, around the region, all growing in this common space. But also in terms of area, we're one of the biggest arboreta in the country. And that's because we have really extensive natural areas. And those natural areas range from, old growth forests to old fields and everything in between. And the science team that we have here really capitalizes on those two assets to understand plants, forests, the natural world in general. And so looking at that team, these are the principal investigators in the research team running that spectrum from really heavily utilizing the collections to the natural areas. And so to introduce you to this cast of characters, on the left, Connor Ryan. He is the director of the Leech Research Station. So heavily on the collection side, looking at specifically rhododendrons, primarily thinking about breeding them for disease resistance, cold, hot tolerance, as well as beauty for the backyard. Also doing a lot of work on conservation in that group of plants. Next up is Juliana Medeiros. So, next one to the right. Juliana also primarily studies rhododendron, is the ecophysiologist. So Juliana thinks about the form and function of plants, primarily rhododendron, and how that suite of characters for plants might predispose them to being resilient to various challenges that they might face, for example, climate change. David Burke is the VP for Science and Conservation. David is, in his heart of hearts, a soil ecologist. So he thinks about what microbes are in the soil and how that might promote or hinder plant growth or success in our forests. More and more, he has been moving into the space of forest health. So right now we are faced with a whole suite of different emerging pests and pathogens. And so his lab is doing a lot to unpack what the threats are in terms of diseases and then looking for resistance among individuals. And so we'll get into that specifically with a case study in beech leaf disease in a minute. The newest member of the team, Sam Worthy, here at the top middle. Sam is a population ecologist and has been starting to look at some of our long-term rare plant data to see how our forests are able to support rare plants. And we'll be supporting the work of the seed bank as well, thinking about, how we can protect different plant species, how we can store those seeds, and how well those seeds can germinate and go back out into the natural world. Sam just joined us in August, and so it's pretty new. Myself, down bottom right, I am the restoration ecologist, so I think about the challenges that our forests are facing right now, sort of as we think about them as a whole, and then different solutions we can enact on our lands to help protect our forests and help ensure we maintain resilient forests in the face of those different challenges. And we'll get into those in a minute. Up at the top is a shot of the city of Cleveland. We have an urban ecologist who will be starting in June. And so that will open up our ability to explore how we can enact, practices within urban spaces, including in Cleveland, to make sure we're able to help promote and maintain green cities, increase tree cover in our cities. So those are the principal investigators in the research team, but we are supported by so many more people and also do a whole lot of training. So you may or may not be aware, but we often have students over here, those students ranging from paid high school interns in the summer, paid college interns, PhD students who are with us year round. They come through a joint program with Case Western Reserve University, our technicians that support the work, and then postdocs, who are people that come here after they finish a PhD to do some additional training and research. So all of these folks are supporting the research. The team ebbs and flows seasonally. Right now in the winter, we're looking at about 23 people in the research team. That'll grow substantially in the summer. So this is just my lab group in a summer. So quite a few people that are supporting the work and also learning to do research in our natural areas, research that supports management, and may go on to be practitioners that can really understand the research side of things. So that's a really huge piece of what we do. I am a trained scientist went through the academic pathway and suspected that I would likely end up being a professor somewhere, I came out here and interviewed for this position, not knowing how much I was going to love it. And I came and I was like, that is the dream job for a scientist like myself. And the reason was because the space has this team of practitioners, conservation scientists, restoration managers, the horticulture team, all of those folks doing actual factual conservation work on the ground that really informs the research I'm able to do. So I think the special sauce at Holden with respect to research, but really with respect to all the things we do, is this blending of action and study that allows us to understand our natural world in a really deep way, and also define best practices, which we're then able to share with the public. So these are some shots of the conservation team doing that real work within our forest to help maintain resilient forests. And that's really the bread and butter of who we are and what makes the sort of research that I do really go. And so to put that in a framework, we have this sort of triad that I think makes us special, and that is we do conservation, research, and inspiration work. So to break that down, we conserve our forests. So we have over 3,000 acres of natural areas, and we have a team of folks that are in those woods conducting action, doing restoration work to really try to preserve those in the healthiest form that we can. Because we have the research team, we can go back in behind them and understand the outcome of what they're doing. So if they say, hey, we're going to manage this forest to increase biodiversity, the research team can go in behind that and say, great, did biodiversity increase? By how much? Can we quantify the effects of the management? We can take that information and feed that back into conservation so they can adapt what they do. And then our capacity to do inspiration. So if we generate that knowledge, what are best practices for combating whatever threat our forest might be facing? Can we share that with the public so that we can enact change beyond the borders of our own property? And this is super important in a region like this. In Ohio in general, about 85% of the forests are privately held. So if we want to see action change and the health of our forests change, or forests remain as forests, whatever the case may be, we really need to capture the hearts and minds of the people that own the forests. And this is not the same as out west, where maybe a vast majority of the lands might be federally held, right? So there you're going to do it by law. Here we're doing it one forest at a time, mostly through education, outreach, information sharing. Why do we do forests? Well, we do forests because that's the dominant ecosystem here in Ohio as a whole. Currently about 38% of the land is in forest. That's reflective of the United States in general. And forests are just really critical habitats, right? They provide habitat for wildlife, protect soil resources, control the flow of water on the landscape, and promote healthier water sources for people. And they sequester a whole bunch of carbon. And in fact, if we're thinking about climate change and looking down the pike in the future, the number one natural solution to climate change is reforestation of previously forested lands. The second most is proper management of the forests that exist and preventing conversion to other land use types. And so in that way, Ohio, in our region, we're in a really unique position because we have tons of these post-agricultural forests ripe for reforestation. We have lots of forests that's vulnerable to conversion for other uses. And so we really have unique capacity here to try to protect the environment. And so I'll just pause here for a second and mention, so I've just given an overview, and now I'm going to sort of dive into some vignettes of the research that we do here. Won't cover everything, just some examples of the kind of stuff that we're doing in my lab and the restoration lab, thinking about our forests, the threats, and the solutions that we have to those. I'll stop a couple times as we go to see if anybody has any questions. So if, as I'm talking, anything pops into your mind, go ahead, type it. I think there must be a chat or some sort of venue for you to convey questions. Send those on, and then I will check in periodically with Kylie, see if we have any questions. We'll address them as we go. So here are 4 of the big threats that we face here. This is sort of anywhere around the globe. We're looking at the threat of land use change. So thinking about forests that turn into farmland or housing developments, and even those sorts of spaces that have been in past land use that are converting back to forest. What are the unique challenges forests in those spaces face? We have climate change, shifting the context in which our forests are existing. We have unprecedented levels of invasion of species from around the globe. And a special subset of those invasions are pests and diseases. And those are a particular threat to forests because we're looking at, wholesale losses of species from our forests. And we can also think in the context of those challenges, what are some of the solutions that we're able to enact? So we see these threats coming, they're already here. What are things that we as people can do to try to protect the forest in the face of those? And Holden is super interesting, a super special place because we're able to use our forests here as living laboratories where we can sort of unpack by the numbers, what are those threats? What are they doing? What does the future look like? And how can we do things in those spaces to protect them? So I guess I'll pause right here before I get into some of the specific research. If anybody has any questions, Kylie, has anything come up?
Not at this point, Katie.
Amazing. So the first thing that we'll talk about is beech leaf disease. And I suspect everybody on this call is either in Northeast Ohio or in Maine, and all of you guys have beech leaf disease. So you've probably all seen it. Just to sort of walk you through what that is, where we started, and why we're in such a unique space to study that. Beech leaf disease was first discovered in Lake County, Ohio in 2012. So a lot of the Arboretum campus sits in Lake County. Wasn't actually discovered first at the Arboretum. It was discovered in one of the Lake Metro parks by one of their naturalists who noted that there was this light banding on beech leaves that he was seeing in the forest, this sort of chevroning pattern. So if you especially are in a forest with very new beech leaf disease and you look up these sort of like backlit leaves, you'll see the banding. It's pretty obvious. Why are the trees banded? Is that a problem? Nobody knew in those early days, only that there was this new patterning on the leaves that they were seeing. David Burke, who's the VP of Science and Conservation, was on the team that helped unpack what was the cause of that. And in fact, they found it to be this foliar nematode. So this is Little Incus crinidae. It's a sort of microscopic worm-like organism. Often nematodes live in the soil. This is specifically a foliar nematode. So it lives in the leaves of specifically beech trees. So it was a species that had never before been seen. And here we sat in Lake County where it seemed that this species was causing some sort of an impact on the beech trees. Here's a map. So they redo this map every year, say, has beech leaf disease been seen in any given county? So you can see the grading going from hot colors. Here we are in Lake County in the red, grading out to this blue color. Every year there are new observations of beech leaf disease. And actually, we're still in January right now. The new map just came out a week ago, so I didn't update it. But 2025, there are new county level observations of beech leaf disease. So this really very fast spread of this novel disease you can see primarily to the east and moving north and much more slowly backing up to the west, getting into Michigan and going south. So all of this tells us is probably a pretty important disease. I showed you that initial picture of the sort of chevron banding on those newly infected leaves. Several years into the disease, this is more likely what we see in those beech trees that are infected. And so what we start to see, instead of, a typical leaf just with the banding, these shrunken leaves, they look quite thickened or leathery. The leaves might drop early, get a second flush of leaves in some cases. If you look at a plant that is heavily infested, you see many fewer leaves than you might expect to see on it. So some level of defoliation. All of this is concerning for us. When we walk through the forests at Holden and we've done some survey work, nearly 100% of beech trees are visibly infected. And so infection is usually quite visible. And almost all of the trees that we look at are infected. The last survey we did, and we just sort of compiled these data, we had looked at nearly 200 trees. All but 2 of them showed visible signs of the disease. And whether or not the other 2 have them, maybe we could get into that with molecular methods. Maybe they don't have it, maybe they do, and they're just not symptomatic yet, unknown. One of the great things about working at a place like Holden is access to long-term data sets. And part of that is because we own the land. And so we can reliably set up experiments and do long-term monitoring on those. And so this is a real big benefit when it comes to new disease that's emerging, because we often have data that predates the disease. So the first question would obviously be, you have this new disease, it's spreading very, very quickly in spaces that have had it for a while. Nearly all of the trees are infected. Are the trees going to die? That would be one of the first questions you might ask. We also would know that, like any living organism, there's some background level of mortality, right? So the question is really, is there death in this species above and beyond what we would expect to just be happening in the absence of the disease? That's what we want to know. And for beech, this is particularly important. Beech is a dominant species in many of our forests that we have here. So, the dominant vegetation type here would be beech maple forest. So if we're standing to lose beech, that's going to really, really reshape what our forests look like. Additionally, this is a space that would have already lost chestnut. Chestnut is a nut bearer, beech is a nut bearer. So looking, when we think about wildlife, to be losing a dominant species, that additionally is really critical for wildlife. So what does that look like in terms of mortality? So using those long-term plots here, looking at a plot at which beech would have arrived in about 2014, so 2 years after it was ever discovered, we can see that, as I said, we are able to have data that predates the disease. There is some low level of mortality that's happening in our beech. We had 2 trees die before the disease arrived. So some level out of several hundred trees. Arrives in 2014. We're kind of going along without much mortality till about 3 or 4 years after arrival. And then we see this really dramatic rise in mortality of beech. As a scientist, I think I always hedge a lot. That's sort of how we're trained. Do we know beech killed these, or beech leaf disease killed these trees? No, but common sense would tell me that the new factor here is beech leaf disease. And our expectation is that that has caused a really dramatic uptick in mortality within beech. And so in this case, in this plot, we were looking 10 years after arrival of the disease at 30% mortality of our beech trees. And so a potentially catastrophic change in our forest. Looking at 30% mortality 1 decade in, but again, with about 100% incidence across those trees. So are they all going to die? Question mark, still monitoring. What we do know from that initial look is that the mortality wasn't distributed evenly across our size classes. So here, using some different sort of bins for sizes that Forest Service puts trees in, saplings and poles being sub-canopy, small and large being, different sizes of canopy reaching trees. We saw much more mortality in our sub-canopy trees, the saplings and poles, much more likely to die than our canopy trees. That said, the canopy trees are infected and don't look great. One of the things that the team is looking when we're looking at the challenges faced by this emerging disease is, are we able to protect the species? And so this is where that work I said David Burke had been doing a lot of this forest health pest sort of work. That team is really focused on looking for potential resistance to disease. So looking for what they would call suspiciously healthy or potentially lingering beech trees. Do we see individuals out in the wild that look pretty good in the face of BLD? Those individuals could potentially harbor genetics that might make them resistant to some extent. And so moving those into a breeding program at some point in tandem with the Forest Service to try to see if we can protect the species by leaning on the biodiversity and the genetics of the species and finding individuals that just have natural resistance. The other component is, in addition to trying to keep beach on the landscape, is that we want to keep forests on the landscape, with the recognition that those forests might look a little bit different in the future than they do today. And so here we're looking at a hemispherical photo of the forest canopy, looking right up the trunk of a beech tree, right? And so if I look up this beech tree, and we take these sorts of photographs regularly across the property, and they help us understand, as the forest gets sicker with beech leaf disease, how is the structure changing? And one of the first things that's going to change is the light levels coming into the forest are going to change. And so we take these photos and we say, how much sky are we seeing when we look at this photo as this tree dies? And so I can look up the base of this beech tree and see that the canopy there attached to that tree looks much thinner to me than the canopy associated with the surrounding trees. So we're already seeing, even if most of the canopy trees are still alive, a change in what's happening on the forest floor just associated with those changes in light levels. And in one of those forests, this is actually in a section of the Arboretum property we call Stebbins, where we've seen a lot of thinning of beech trees. We're seeing this mass recruitment, in this case of tulip poplar. It's not what we see everywhere. It's a little bit variable across the property in different forest sites. But in this case, we're seeing sort of this carpeting of tulip poplar that you can't see through. Tulip poplar is a nice native. It's pretty different in terms of its ecological function than beech. And so understanding what might be coming in behind the beech is going to help us understand where that forest is going. And it's going to help us understand whether or not we're going to want to get in front of that with any sort of management. And so if we're thinking back to this tulip poplar thicket, maybe we want to get a little bit more biodiversity in there, but this isn't the same situation we'd be in if we had a lot of invasive shrubs in our understory. Maybe we're thinking, is that going to convert to some sort of shrub kind of thicket as the beech thin out? And so how can we understand what the context is, what the future might be for that forest, and try to do some management in front of that to ensure that we maintain a pretty biodiverse, nice, resilient forest, even in the wake of a disease? So that's sort of where we stand with beech leaf disease and our research at Holden, at least from sort of the restoration ecology side of things. Are there any questions, thoughts before we jump into the next section?
Hi, Katie. Yeah, I'm going to just pop in with a question here. Are you working with community partners to support, your research with beech leaf disease, either on the research side or more so on like the actionable side?
Yeah, sort of on all sides. So a couple ways that we partner pretty extensively in the space of forest health, including beech leaf disease, but also I'll name a few other ones that we partner with before I talk about the partnerships. Things of concern in our forest right now: beech leaf disease, ash, emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, and Dutch elm disease. So 4 big diseases, all impacting our forests, all impacting street trees, especially in the case of ash and elm. All our spaces where we have partnerships to try to protect those species. 2 big partnerships. One is with the U.S. Forest Service. We are the home base for the Great Lakes Basin Forest Health Collaborative, which is a large collaborative run out of Holden that brings together partners and stakeholders across different sorts of institutions. So we're thinking federal government, state governments, not just Ohio, but beyond, universities, nonprofits, and for-profit industries, all working together to technology share and build capacity for breeding resilience and resistance. The other one is the Tree Species in Peril program, which is run through the Nature Conservancy, of which we are a partner. Similarly, bringing together individuals from across industries to work on finding resistant, resilient individuals throughout the country, moving them into breeding programs to try to promote that work. Yeah, so lots of partnerships with lots of different sorts of organizations to help make that work move faster at a really large spatial scale, because we don't have tons of time when it comes to these sorts of diseases.
Thank you, Katie. And just one additional question here, kind of dovetailing off of the partnerships that you just spoke to. Do you ever get to influence environmental policy on the state and federal government level?
Yeah, to some extent. I wonder if Ed might have a better answer to this, but perhaps this is not what he wants to jump in on. But from time to time, we have been called in, or experts from Holden, to speak at the State House when they're often thinking through, like, in what direction do they want to put resources that might support this sort of work. And so, we'll speak to, say, the value of ODNR to ensure that they have the resources that they need so that they can, help us do the work of supporting the landowners, if that makes sense. So those are the spaces in which I've seen us work at the state and at the federal level to try to ensure that people understand what the challenges are and where potential solutions can come from, and making sure that there's capacity to sort of enact change in those spaces.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. That's all we have for now.
Great. So we're going to switch gears from thinking about pests and diseases, though I think that the challenges here are very similar in terms of, how we think about biodiversity and harnessing the power of that to protect forests broadly. One of the other big challenges we have is our past agricultural history, and with that, the non-native shrubs that sort of come in those spaces. And I'm not from Ohio originally. I have worked my way all around the country, and everybody's forest is invaded with some woody shrub from Europe. And it's a different species in all the cases, but everybody in the country seems to have this challenge. This is a forest that does not have that challenge. This is Stebbins. So I don't know how many of you guys have done the Stebbins Gulch hike. If you haven't done it, it's pretty spectacular. Highly recommend next time they're doing a guided tour of Stebbins Gulch. This is sort of the uplands on the other side of the gulch. And this is an old growth forest, recently got an old growth designation from the Old Growth Network. And this is some of the forest that we steward. And there's a lot to like about this forest in this picture. So I see these like large, widely spaced old trees. The understory, this is in the spring, has this just carpet of spring ephemerals. I see lots of mid-story tree species coming up. And this is a shot of a forest we call Working Woods. Some of you might have been there. This is a pretty accessible to the public forest. As you're coming down Spare, you'll see the signs for Working Woods. This is not an old growth forest. So this is a very young forest. I would describe it sort of as like a teenage forest. It's about 70 years old. And this is a lot of what we have at Holden. And I love that we can steward old growth forests like Stebbins. And I love that we have these teenage forests, because this is what a lot of the public has in the region, right? And so they can come here and see old growth forest, and they can come here and see a forest that is reflective of the forest that they are likely to have. And, the Working Woods forest is just so very different from Stebbins in a lot of ways. And so looking at the shot of Working Woods, I can see that we are lacking an understory herbaceous layer, in part because it's choked out by this really intense thicket of non-native shrubs. We have a much higher density of trees, more tightly packed, much slower growing, smaller diameter trees. They are much less diverse in terms of species, also in terms of age classes. So this is a forest where we have, mostly 70-year-old red maple. So not a lot of diversity in species, age class, understory. And I will say, coming on the heels of the disease question, that is a little bit of a challenge when we think about current threats and unknown threats, right? So if we have a forest that's dominated by 70-year-old red maple, it might look like a great forest right now, but if the next threat targets 70-year-old red maple, we don't have a lot of flexibility there, right? We stand to potentially lose the forest. And so what we'd like to see is a more diverse, more resilient, more flexible forest. And so, you know, I mentioned that example of the teenage forest was in Working Woods. Here's an aerial shot of some of that forest at Working Woods. And Working Woods is, at its core, a public demonstration of forest management. And I am sitting here talking to you about it as a researcher. And I think this is the really special thing about working at Holden and our capacity to do research that has high impact for the real world. And this is, you know, in 2017, I was pretty new here. So I've been at the organization for over 9 years. 2017, been here for about a year. The conservation team approached me and they said, hey, we want to put in a forest management demonstration for the public, show them different ways they could potentially manage the forest. Do you want to be involved on the research side of things? And I was like, heck yeah, that's exactly what I want to do. I want to do research on top of things that would actually happen. But also, if we're going to do it, could you please set it up as an experiment? And, you know, we're talking replicates and we're talking controls. And like, it has to be done in a certain way. And they said, absolutely, we can do that. And so we're looking at this map. We'll see a better map of it in a minute. But this is, you know, as you enter through the deer fence, you're leaving the deer excluded area, entering the forest where there would be deer. There's this map, and you can see how I made them make these different little square plots, which is maybe not what conservation would have done if left to their own devices, but they were happy to overlay research onto it. And so we were looking at a forest, you know, like this, dominated in the understory by multiflora rose or glossy buckthorn. It's pretty patchy, so you tend to get one or the other. And asking, can we accelerate the trajectory of this teenage forest to the sort of stately grandmother forest state in less than 500 years? Like, is that possible? Can we put numbers on it? And in doing so, can we define best practices for forest management to help people manage pretty resilient forests? And so here's that map. As I said, Working Woods is actually divided into, in my head, it's divided into two sections. It's the north and the south. Here we'll be talking about the north. So if you've been there and visited, there's the timber demonstration. That's not the part that I work in. I work in the north. This is the part that's had some lighter management that would be pre-harvest. So the management that happened in the section of Working Woods that I do research in is two things. So first, to thin that canopy a little bit by about 20%. So we looked at those sort of small, densely packed 70-year-old, primarily red maples, some tulip maples, some sugar maple. Can we thin that out a little bit to free up resources, to help more different species grow, increase species richness, help some younger individuals grow, get some different age classes in there? And then, and another common management recommendation for the region, remove the non-native shrubs. And so because we were setting it up as an experiment, we have those replicates. So there are plots that have been thinned alone. So the canopy has been thinned by about 20%, thinned and removed the non-native species. And the idea is, if we thin the canopy, we're going to bring in some more resources to the understory that might promote recruitment of new individuals, hopefully new native trees, maybe some native shrubs. If we do that without removing the invasive shrubs, are we just going to grow bigger thickets of invasive shrubs? Probably. But is it easy to remove the invasive shrubs? It is not. So if we want to make a compelling argument to the public that they need to remove their invasive shrubs, we better be pretty sure that that's an important piece of the equation. So here we test it. And then finally, leaving sections of it unmanaged. I think this drives the conservation team crazy to no end, because that leaves a source of propagules to move back into the managed spaces, just like if you managed your land and your neighbor did not. You would constantly have these propagules coming in. So it is what's going on in the real landscape. But also, if we wanted a more productive and biodiverse forest, And we managed the whole thing. And then in 20 years, we said, look, we have more species and they grew more quickly. Somebody could counter that and say, well, maybe everything loves it 3 degrees warmer. So you would have had more biodiversity regardless of your actions. This allows us to compare directly. When we did nothing, 20 years later, we had this. When we did something, 20 years later, we had that. So this was really critical to turning this into an experiment. And in the world of science right now, there's a sort of buzzword, co-production, where scientists work together with practitioners to generate a better product. And, you know, this word came on my radar maybe 3 years ago, but I was like, oh, this is what Holden's been doing for forever. It's the close proximity of the people that are practicing the actions and doing the research together that allows us to do something that's more real and make sure that we are actually quantifying and defining best practices that might actually be done. So if we look at this photograph of working woods, we can see 2 treatments. We have them marked with these ropes. So you can see this rope right down the middle of the photograph. On the left, you can see an unmanaged plot. You can see that thicket of non-native shrubs. On the right, we have a managed plot. So you can see just visually, they're really different. And again, this was the hard labor of the conservation team going in and enacting those changes. And then the research team going behind them and quantifying, like, are those trees growing at a different rate? Is more or less, you know, new species recruiting into the plot? So the first question that everybody wants to know, are we able to grow bigger trees? Are the trees growing faster? And so here, looking at those data, how fast are the trees growing? The 3 most common trees in the plots are red maple, sugar maple, tulip poplar. Here, using this sort of coding, C is the control, that's where we did nothing. T is the thinning, only dealt with the canopy. T plus R, thinning plus removal. That's the like whole enchilada, right? Like the canopy was thinned and the invasive shrubs were removed. And so we see that when we take action in the forest, when we thin that canopy and remove the invasive shrubs, we're able to have those trees that remain grow more quickly. It's important to me because it's sequestering more carbon in those trees. It's important to a landowner that might want to make some money in the future because they can harness a subset of the trees for timber more quickly in the future. Might be important for wildlife habitat or a whole slew of reasons. And we try to meet people where they're at when it comes to making recommendations for forest management. In addition to looking at the canopy trees that remain, we're looking really closely at who's coming up in the understory, who's living, who's dying, how fast are they growing. Why? Because it's the next generation of the forest. So will that forest become more biodiverse? What direction is it going to go? One of the things that we did, and this I had mentioned at the beginning, we have lots of trainees. This was work that was done by Alexa Wagner, who was a PhD student here, through the Bioscience Alliance. That's a partnership between ourselves, Case Western Reserve University, and the Cleveland Metro Parks Zoo. So Alexa Wagner did all of her research at Holden and got her degree and did her coursework at Case Western. And so she set up an experiment where she looked at fruit production. This is, you know, how reproductive are individuals going to be within the understory of the forest, and looked specifically at these understory plants, understory woody plants. She looked at spicebush and glossy buckthorn. Spicebush, if you don't know it, is a really nice native shrub. Glossy buckthorn is one of those invasives that we have in big thickets. And so here, looking at 2 of the treatments, control and canopy thinning. We didn't look at thinning plus removal because if we removed the glossy buckthorn, it was not there to reproduce. So those would have all been zeros. But when we thin the canopy, we see that we increase reproductive output of these shrubs. That's great when we're talking about spicebush. That is not great when we're talking about glossy buckthorn, right? So if that's a species that's undesirable in our forest, that maybe thwarts some of the increase in biodiversity we're looking to get, that is not so great. So right then and there, that's concerning to us that if we manage, but only manage the canopy, we might be setting ourselves up for some problems with invasive shrubs. We then looked at the recruitment of native trees into the understory and looking at how many individuals are recruiting in the control and the thinning plus invasive shrub removal, we see an uptick in recruitment, but only when we remove the invasive shrubs in tandem with the canopy thinning. So a second bit of evidence that probably the invasive shrub removal is a pretty critical piece of forest management in the region. And you can look at this picture and sort of understand that intuitively, right? Like if you're a little baby tree trying to come up under those invasive shrubs versus in this nice sort of cleared understory landscape, you're going to do much better in that clear space. It's going to be really hard to compete with those European shrubs in the forest that's depicted on the left. And so when we think about like making management recommendations or defining best practice, almost certainly removing those invasive shrubs is going to be a big part of that equation. But also it's not easy. So I mentioned that, you know, when I described the treatments at the beginning, it's really hard. And not everybody's going to have capacity to do that. In addition, we know that if you were to go in and remove these invasive shrubs, you'd come back the next year, they'd be back. And so it requires this dedicated annual maintenance. And so if you say to somebody that this is probably a pretty important piece of management, but also that you need to commit to it every year, people might say, no, thank you. Like, that's not that important to me to spend that time. And this is, I think, one of the really cool things about working so closely with conservation is we've started actually making science happen together, not just me overlaying science on the work that they do, but co-creating the science, co-creating the data collection piece of it. And so in this case, you know, we were maybe 4 years into forest management working woods, and my team had been looking at the composition of the forest plant community. We knew how many invasive shrubs were in that forest. We had been collecting that data every year. And 4 years in, I said to the conservation team, do you guys know how long it takes you to remove the invasive shrubs? Like, do you maybe know that? And they said, yes, they had been writing that down every year. So that gave us 2 pieces of data to try to wrap our brains more around actually what is the time commitment that it would take to remove these invasive shrubs. And so this was work that was wrangled by David Jenkins. He's one of the lab technicians here, the lead technician of my lab. And so first we took the data that our lab had. You know, what is the percent cover of invasive shrubs in these plots? There were 6 plots that had this treatment. And as I said, the shrubs are really patchily distributed. So sometimes we get tons, sometimes it's not so bad. Worst case scenario, before any management happened, we were looking at about 35% cover by invasive shrubs within a plot. So if you looked at the ground, 35% of the ground was covered by invasive shrubs. Best case scenario, we're looking more like 5%. So pretty variable, but pretty significant in some cases. 5 or 6 years after management, we were looking at about 3% covered by invasive shrubs. So we couldn't get rid of them totally, but we were able to knock them back substantially. And how much time did that take? So, you know, the worst case scenario was, again, you know, 35, 40, 45% covered by invasive shrubs. How much time would it take to get rid of them? Here we're looking at, these are divided just for frame of reference into half-hectare plots. That's 100 meters by 50 meters. Worst case scenario, most heavily invaded plot, took about 45 person-hours to remove the invasive shrubs in that first year. That's a lot of time. And so if you were looking at that and saying, well, that was going to take me over a week of work, and I was going to have to do that every year, again, a landowner might say, no, thank you. But when we looked at the actual numbers, we saw that that was reduced pretty quickly to about 4 hours in a year. And so that becomes something that might be doable. And we saw that reduction across the board. So about a tenfold reduction in how much time somebody could expect to spend removing invasive shrubs. That's something we can take to landowners, that we can bake into management plans. Maybe in that first year, they're going to seek external funding to help get a handle on the invasive shrubs. But after that, it becomes something that they can commit to. And so I think that sort of information is really critical in our ability here to empower landowners. We're telling them not only about, what best practices are as defined by the science that we've enacted here, but also using that science to empower the more social side of it to help people make those decisions in a really informed way. And so, Working Woods is this space where we invite the public in to see a demonstration of forest management. For me, it's a living laboratory. It's a classroom, an outdoor classroom. It's a lot of things to a lot of people. One of the first reasons it was set up was to combat this. So this is a forest that's been clear cut in order to harvest timber. And we see this a lot in the region. Somebody doesn't know that their forest is worth anything, the wood is worth anything. And then somebody approaches them and says they'll pay them for their trees, and they end up with a clear cut. And the thing that they don't know is that they could have harvested timber, made the same amount of money, but still have a forest at the end. So this is the southern section of Working Woods. This is a section that has had timber removed and sold. And in fact, this is the gap. So they made one gap just as an example. So if somebody wanted to make a light gap within their forest. So this is about the most intensively logged that forest is. If you walk in today, and this was right after logging, if you walk in today, you'll see a forest that looks like any other forest. You wouldn't necessarily know that timber had been extracted from the forest. It's a space that the public can come on their own. There's a set of trails through there. There's signage to help walk you through the trail. And some of it, just these markers, some interpretive signage to talk you through the process of what the forest management is. It's also a space that we're able to invite the public in more formal ways, doing guided tours, doing workshops, hands-on workshops, for example, how to use a chainsaw, woodworking, mushroom log classes, you name it. It's often held at Working Woods. And most recently, the shift to allow us to engage landowners where they are. And so looking here at the new consulting forestry program, has been up and running for a year. Here you can have consulting foresters come out to your property, look at your land, and come up with really tailored guidelines based on your goals and the threats that your forests face. That might be timbering, that might be mushroom, that might be maple, other different land uses, wildlife habitat. They can sort of work that in, meeting landowners where they are and making sure that they're getting what they need out of their forest in order to encourage them to keep forest as forest, because we know it's so critical. And so, we use the forest at Holden to unpack a whole bunch of different threats, non-native shrubs, agriculture, past, emerging pests and diseases, including beech leaf disease, and also understanding how we can take action to push back against those threats and make resilient and resistant forests for the future. And so we take this combined ethos, conserve, understand, inspire, using our own space to conserve what we've got here, understand how we're doing it and define best practices, and then inspire those actions beyond our borders. And so with that, I will take any questions that might have popped up.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think at this moment, things are looking pretty good. So I'm actually going to turn things over to Ed. If you don't mind sharing or stop sharing your screen there, Katie, I'm going to just pop something up here for us as well. And Ed, go ahead and take it from here.
Well, thank you, Kylie. And thank you so much, Dr. Stubel, for presenting to all of us. I really want to thank all of you for joining. And I think that Katie's work and the work of her team that she shared with us today is really exemplifies our mission in action. And I think, as Katie shared, really what we try to do is to understand our environment, to develop practical solutions, and to not keep them to ourselves. We're all about sharing that information, that new knowledge, and helping to make our communities stronger and greener for ourselves and for future generations. I would invite you to reach out to any of us to continue the conversation if there's any questions that you have. If you have a particular plot of land and would want to participate in the Working Woods program, if you're interested in learning more about any of our science programs, I'd encourage you to reach out. Also, if you take a look at the screen here, you can see the schedule of the upcoming our nature programs that are going to be occurring over the course of the next few months. The topics range everything from creativity to our educational programs and their connection to the community, to the role of horticulture in civic and urban spaces. So just as broad as the ways that we improve lives through horticulture, that's the and land management, that's as broad as these topics go. So would love to see you at these upcoming events. And I want to thank all of you for joining. And thank you again, Dr. Sewell, for your great presentation. Thanks, everybody. See you around the gardens.